Every schoolchild learns the same date, 1619, the year the first enslaved Africans arrived on American soil. But what if 1619 isn't the beginning of the story at all? What if it's the middle of a story that was written down thousands of years earlier in a promise made to a man named Abraham? The Septuagint reads, "They shall enslave them and afflict them and humble them 400 years." A prophecy spoken centuries before the first slave ship ever set sail. Today, we're going to follow the paper trail, old maps, old books, old scripture, and do the math ourselves. Forget about 1619 and remember that 400 years of slavery was prophesied. We will start with the scattering. To understand where this story really begins, we have to go back to the fall of Jerusalem, when the biblical Israelites were scattered from their native soil. History tells us that over time, groups of these scattered Israelites traveled alongside the Moors into Europe, settling in Spain, Portugal, and beyond. Historian Joseph Kroskoff described what that scattering actually looked like. In his book, The Jews and Moors in Spain, he says, "Forth they went from their native soil to roam the wide world over, everywhere homeless, friendless, despised, trodden down, hunted down by man and beast, tortured, an object of derision, a shadow of their former greatness. And when occasionally a ray of tolerance found its way to these outcast people, that single ray was at once recalled by priests who were more cunning and contriving than human and godly, for only upon the suffering of the mother religion could the daughter religion expect to exist." Generation after generation, this wandering continued until it led somewhere very specific, the west coast of Africa, a place history would come to call the Slave Coast. And now we will explain how the Slave Coast and the Kingdom of Judah coincide. This is a British map drawn in 1747. Look closely at the west coast of Africa, and you'll find a region labeled the Kingdom of Judah, spelled in the style of the time, Juda. Just above it, another label, Negro Land. Judah isn't a random name. It's the name of one of the tribes of Jacob, the tribe of King David himself. When the United Kingdom of Israel split in two, Judah became the name of the southern kingdom. And on this map, centuries later, we find that exact name attached to a kingdom on the West African coast, sitting on what came to be known as the Slave Coast. The English writer John Ogilvy described this same region in his book, Africa, writing about the late 1400s. He wrote, "Many Jews are scattered over this region, some natives boasting themselves of Abraham's seed, inhabiting both sides of the river Niger. Others are Asian strangers who fled thither either from the desolation of Jerusalem by Vespasian, or from Judea, wasted and depopulated by the Romans, Persians, Saracens, and Christians, or else such as came out of Europe whence they were banished." Ogilvy goes further. He lists the nations that expelled their Jewish populations in the centuries before. Italy in 1342, the Low Countries in 1350, France in 1403, England in 1422, Spain in 1462, and Portugal in 1497. Wave after wave of expulsion, and each time some portion of that scattered population was pushed further out, some eventually banished to or fleeing toward this same stretch of West Africa, Negro land. Another pronunciation for Judah at this time was Ouidah, and this referred to the city of Judaic people. Ouidah, within that region, set a coastal city that would become one of the busiest slave ports on earth. Ouidah is also spelled Wydydah, Fida, Hwedah, Juda, or Ajuda, depending on who was writing it down. A French geographical publication, the Société Languedocienne Geography Bulletin, describes the city plainly. Ouidah, city of Benin, which was at the time of the Kingdom of Dahomey, the main coastal city, its inhabitants, who they called Judaic, passed from a remnant of the dispersed tribes of Israel. The French geographer Alexis Reclus documented the same thing in 1892 in his sweeping survey of world geography. He wrote, "East of Great Popo begins the Dahomey territory, guarded by the important town of Glewé, known to Europeans by the various names of Fida, Havida, Ouidah. The old writers called it Judah, and its inhabitants were said to be Jews. During the flourishing days of the slave trade, from 16 to 18,000 were annually transported from Judah, which at that time had a population of 35,000. Portuguese ships first reached this coastline around 1485 to 1486, establishing contact and beginning slave trafficking almost immediately. By the mid-1500s, roughly 1530 to 1550, Portuguese traders were regularly working the port of Ouidah itself, referring to it by that same name, Judah. This is where the documented, dated history of the transatlantic slave trade in this region begins. 1619 is a different story. It traces the first arrival to the American coastline. This is the date that most of us were actually taught, the year the first group of these ancient Israelites arrived on American soil. In Lost Tribes and Promised Lands, historian Ronald Sanders relays what Captain John Smith recorded from colonist John Rolfe's own journal. About the last of August, 1619, came in a Dutchman of war that sold us 20 negars. This is the moment many of us use as the start clock, but by now you can see this isn't where the story starts. It's where one chapter of it lands, more than a century after the trafficking from that same coastline has already begun. Now that we have the start date, let's look a little further and see when the end date is. So when did it end? Across the Atlantic world, abolition came in waves between 1833 and 1888. Haiti was the earliest, abolishing slavery between 1793 and 1804 through its revolution. Brazil was the last, holding on until 1888. Now here's where we do the math ourselves. If Portuguese trafficking activity in the Ouidah or Judah region began around 1485 to 1486, and slavery in the Atlantic world finally ended in 1888 with Brazil's abolition, then the span of enslavement runs roughly 402 to 403 years. 400 years, almost to the year. Isaiah 55:11 tells us that a word that goes out of the Most High's mouth does not return to him void. It accomplishes the thing that he says. That number, 400 years, is not a coincidence. It's a number Scripture wrote down first, thousands of years earlier, in the book of Genesis, when the Most High promised Abraham the land. Abraham asked a simple question: how will I know that I will actually inherit it? God told Abraham to gather 5 animals, a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a turtle dove and a pigeon. He divided the 3 larger animals in half, laying the pieces opposite one another, but he did not divide the birds. That left 8 pieces of flesh on the ground, 4 on each side. Birds of prey came down onto the carcass, and Abraham sat down next to them. As the sun began to set, and about sunset, a trance fell upon Abram, and lo, a great gloomy terror falls upon him. And it was said to Abram, thou shalt surely know that thy seed shall be a sojourner in a land not their own, and they shall enslave them and afflict them and humble them 400 years. And the nation whomsoever they shall serve, I will judge. And after this they shall come forth hither with much property. But thou shalt depart to thy fathers in peace, nourished in a good old age. And in the 4th generation they shall return hither, for the sins of the Amorites are not yet filled up, even until now. This was the first half of God's answer to Abraham's question. It told him the promise would not happen in his own lifetime. Before his descendants could inherit the land, 3 things had to happen first. They had to be enslaved. The nation that enslaved them had to be judged, and they had to come out of that enslavement with great property. But there's a 4th requirement, and it comes a few verses later, when God reveals exactly how large that inheritance would be. In that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to thy seed I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. That's the 4th requirement. Abraham's descendants must ultimately inherit a territory stretching from the river of Egypt all the way to the great river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, and more. So now it's pretty clear that this prophecy could not possibly have been fulfilled in Egypt because the 4 requirements have never been fully met. But there's another reason why this prophecy could not possibly have been fulfilled in Egypt back in the time of Moses and Pharaoh, and we're going to dig into that next. So most of us, including myself, were taught that this 400-year prophecy was fulfilled during Israel's bondage in Egypt. But when you actually run the numbers that Scripture provides, you will find that it is not mathematically possible. And there's a second reason it doesn't fit either. Israel wasn't even afflicted the entire time they were there. Start with Genesis 46:8, which lists the descendants of Israel who went down to Egypt, including a man named Kohath, the grandfather of Moses. Exodus 6:18 tells us Kohath lived to be 133 years old. His son Amram, Moses' father, lived to 137, according to Exodus 6:20. Moses himself was 80 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, according to Exodus 7:7. He then spent 40 years in the wilderness, according to Joshua 5:6, and died at age 120, according to Deuteronomy 34:7. Even in the most generous possible reading, even if Kohath arrived in Egypt at birth, and each son was born the very year his father died, The absolute maximum time in Egypt cannot exceed 350 years, not 400, 350 at the outside. And the math isn't the biggest problem. Genesis 45 and 18 through 20 tells us that when Joseph's family first arrived, Pharaoh welcomed all of them, offered them the best of the land of Egypt, sent wagons to bring them, and told them not to worry about their belongings. They were not afflicted the moment they arrived. The affliction didn't begin until after that. Pharaoh died years, like generations later. So where does this number 430 come from? Exodus 12 and 40 says Israel sojourned in Egypt for 430 years. And this verse gets misread as if it's the same prophecy from Genesis 15. It isn't. Exodus 12 and 40 is actually describing Abraham's descendants' entire sojourning from both Canaan and Egypt combined, not a standalone 430-year stay in Egypt. The Septuagint, a Greek translation of Scripture written centuries before the Masoretic Hebrew text, confirms exactly this reading. Put it all together, and the conclusion is unavoidable. The 400-year prophecy of Genesis 15 was not, could not have been fulfilled during Israel's time in Egypt. But I'll tell you when this prophecy was fulfilled. It was fulfilled in modern times. So if it didn't happen in Egypt in biblical times, when did it happen? Here's the catch. Although this prophecy didn't happen in the biblical era, it did happen in modern history from 1485 to 1486, when Portuguese traffickers first began capturing people along the slave coast, also known as Judah, to 1888, when Brazil finally abolished slavery, is approximately 400 years. Remember, the prophecy didn't stop at enslavement. It also required that the nation which enslaved them be judged, and that they come out with great property, and that they ultimately inherit the land from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. To this day, none of those last three has been fully realized, which means the story itself is still unfolding. But there's another prophecy that I want you to see. There's one more piece of scripture that points directly at this history, and it doesn't come from Genesis. It comes from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 28:68 in the Septuagint reads, "And the Lord shall bring thee back to Egypt in ships, by the way of which I said, thou shalt not see it again. And ye shall be sold there to your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and none shall buy you." Notice the detail, ships, plural. This isn't describing a walk back down the road to a neighboring country. It's describing a captivity that required multiple vessels crossing water to reach. In all of recorded history, there is only one people forced into bondage by ships on that scale across an ocean, those taken during the Atlantic slave trade, captured on the slave coast of Africa and scattered across the globe. So forget 1619 as a starting point. Start instead with a map from 1747, a book written in the 1400s, a promise made to Abraham long before either one existed. Line them up and the math holds. Roughly 400 years from the first ships on the slave coast to the last chains broken in Brazil, just as it was written. The prophecy said enslavement, judgment, coming out with property, and finally inheriting the land. We've only finished step one. There are three more to go. If this connected the dots for you, share it with someone who's still working from 1619 as page one. And let me know in the comments, where do you think the story goes from here?